Hello, welcome everyone to today's event. We will be in conversation with the photographer Sama Alshaibi, and the title of today's event is Reimagining the Female Figure in War and Conflict. My name is Nadje Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown University. Today's event is part of a larger series called Gender and Body Politics, Arts in the Middle East and its Diaspora, which is co-convened by Brown Center for Middle East Studies and the Center for Middle East Studies, or the Middle East Institute at Columbia University. Over the past couple of years, my colleague and co-convener, Professor Kathryn Poots, and I have been in discussion with a number of different artists, including the Palestinian artist Basil Abbas and Rouan Abu Rahmeh, with the Lebanese artist Tanya Al-Khouri and Annabelle Dow, and Iranian artist Murshin Alayahi and Amethyst Mutawalli. Against the backdrop of war and conflict, the rise of authoritarian regimes, displacement and diasporalization, Islamophobia, ongoing Orientalist depictions, this series attempts to explore the ways in which artists are informed by and contribute to transnational feminist and queer praxis. Before I'm going to ask my colleague, Professor Kathryn Spellman Poots, to introduce Sama, just want to say a few words about today's format. So Kathryn and myself will be in conversation with Sama for a while, and we encourage you to put in your questions or comments in the Q&A function, and we will have some time for discussion. Now let me introduce Kathryn, who is going to give Sama to you. Kathryn Spellman Poots is based at Columbia's Middle East Institute and the Aga Khan University in London. Her research focuses on women and gender dynamics in Muslim communities in the UK and the US. She has particular interest in cultural production within the context of diasporic spaces and their connections to wider social movements. Over to you, Kathryn.
Great. Thank you so much, Nadia. And thank you so much for Sama to be part of our series. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Sama Alshaibi. Sama is a conceptual artist who uses video art, performative photography, sculpture, and installation in her work. War, exile, power, and the quest for survival are themes that are seen in her works. She often uses her own body in her artwork as representations of a country or an issue that she's dealing with. Sama was named the 2021 Guggenheim Fellow in Photography, and she's exhibited extensively throughout the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa since 2003. She's held solo exhibitions in New York, in London, Dubai, Guatemala City, Jerusalem, Ramallah, and Arizona. Her project, Sicilia, was exhibited in the 55th Venice Biennale in 2013 as part of the Maldives Pavilion. And in 2019, she was selected as an artist in residence at Art Pace in San Antonio. And that culminated in a solo exhibition titled Under Total Liberation. She also represented the US in the 13th International Cairo Biennale in 2019. And her video work, Wasl, Arabic for Union, was included in the inaugural 2017 Honolulu Biennial. And she's been selected as one of the 60 artists for the State of the Art 2020 at Crystal Bridges in Arkansas, which was curated by Lauren Haynes. So it's such a rich biography, and we're really excited to be in conversation with Sama. So there we go. Yay, welcome. It's nice
Thanks for joining us. And in addition to this more formal introduction, I should also say that I've known Sama for a long time, for over 20 years, and we used to participate in lots of events at the time around the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Welcome, Sama. I'm going to start off with the first question, and I'm going to ask, and this is without wanting to reduce you to your background and identities, but I cannot help but wonder how hard it must be to not engage your Iraqi Palestinian family background. Let's talk about Palestine in a moment, but given the way I met you and we worked together, I wanted to start out with the work you did on Iraq. And at this time, of course, Iraq was very much at the forefront of our minds, and we shared the spaces in which we talked about Iraq. So can you say a little bit about that period and how you processed what was happening in Iraq and how you processed that creatively?
Yes, thank you so much, Nadje and Kathryn and everybody here. It's great to be with you all. I'm going to answer that question in just a moment. I just wanted to quickly just say thank you and also express with our audience today my feelings in particular about just wanting to send love to Hisham and his friends Kanan and Tahsin, who were shot recently, and one of them is your student. Being a mother myself, of young son, being in college is very kind of critical moment, and it just feels really important to just ground that before starting talking about the image representations of the body and war, as they're very related, right? In the sort of dehumanization of Middle East peoples, and how it originates really for me at that time when I met you, Nadje. I think I met you around 2006 and I had just finished graduate school in 2005. And so for me, starting graduate school in 2002 was really at the 1-year anniversary of 9/11. And 9/11 itself being the event that sort of crystallized my determination to go to graduate school and start making my work about my personal history, as that was sort of the starting point, and then how that grew into my larger work. This is a clip from one of my very first projects. I'm not going to put the sound on because it's kind of hard to do with in a Zoom format. But this is a little clip from one of my graduate projects, very first graduate projects when I was in Boulder, Colorado at CU, and in dialogue with another graduate student, Joseph Barbrook. This is a collaboration. Joseph's his grandparents having died in Auschwitz, and we were having these conversations about our background. I am Palestinian and Iraqi, displaced by the Iraq-Iran War of the early 80s, and which created a context for me of living and moving across the Middle East and then to the United States, where I spent a period of my time being undocumented until being afforded refugee status during the first Gulf War. And that story and legacy of war predates even my birth, with my mother being Palestinian and being displaced by the 1948 Nakba to Baghdad, Iraq, where she was raised along with her siblings and parents. And so this conversation of war has been, this concept of war and this reality of war has been a major driver of my life, my relationship to land, my relationship to various statuses and identities. And in this clip, just real quickly, since we're at the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq, you can see at this moment, this is when they're announcing the US had actually invaded Iraq. And so you have a video of our dialogue, of having a conversation. You have the right top box, which is a protest movements that were sweeping the nations, but not being documented on TV and not being represented on TV. And on the bottom, the kind of news propaganda that we're being fed. And I think this sort of embodies everything that I try to do later with my representation of my own physical body and performance work, where storytelling, narratives, representation of the media, what's not included, and having a resistance and resilience through the image. So, right after that period of graduate school, I was doing many projects, and we're going to return to that conversation as we talk about birthright in Palestine. But I will talk about the project that was one of my major projects after graduate school, Between Two Rivers. And this is around the time I met you, Nadje. highly influenced by your research and work as well, and considering the representations of post-colonial scholar Edward Said and his theories around Orientalism. Sorry, I meant to say there, Orientalism and sort of flattening, and how the representations of the East are embodied through text, through films, through photographs, artworks, paintings, and so this winds up being like major factors in my work. And I this is around the time I'm really, or maybe just a little bit before this, really exploring the symbols of dispossession and war and the female body, and thinking about them being iconic signifiers of the nation or of the cause, and how to sort of disrupt the kind of imagery that we were seeing in the West and what was being characterized about how we should feel about the Middle East, and especially at that time, in particular, Palestine and Iraq. So this image, after the vote on the left, which is my image using my own body, references a lot of the images that we were seeing around that time, trying to glorify and justify the US invasion of Iraq by conflating bringing Western democracy to Iraq with the idea of exporting female autonomy and women's rights. And what this image doesn't really, these images that you see that were all over across the press, what they don't really speak to is how women actually always were voting in Iraq. I mean, they might have only had Saddam Hussein to vote for that period, but they were always voting. And so, but these images kind of, the tears and the purple stained fingers and this idea of different kinds of women and the politics of veiling, right? All of these issues around veiling and what we were bringing when the war was not turning out the way the Bush administrations had forecasted, what it would be this sort of liberation of the Iraq people, and that was described visually through the liberation of women's rights and opportunities, right? Women's rights. And so thinking about after this vote, the kind of breakdown of society, of sectarian conflict in Iraq, and what are the conditions for everybody, but the vulnerabilities in women in particular in moments of war, begins to get described in this project. Also using the body having the physical markers of violence was a component of this work. I was also interested in kinds of images that spoke to resilience and resistance, and not to have, even though these are difficult images that are brings the kind of vulnerability and violence to the body, it also has a very sort of empowered visual voice. And that was also really important to me. I was very much inspired at that time reading about Iraq, just subtle acts by everyday people to resist their conditions, or at least to cope with their conditions. And one of them being an article about Iraqis using tattoos in parts of their bodies to be identifying markers should they be killed or wind up in morgues, which were overwhelmed by the amount of bodies that were being received. And especially because of the kidnappings that were happening of family members, and to have some sort of proof of life, or some proof of life by asking what the identifying markers and the tattoos would be. So to me, this was a kind of very resilient coping strategy that Iraqis were physically enacting onto their bodies. This becomes the cover of one of your books, Nadje, Women in War, and using the ancient language of cuneiform of Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamian language. On the left side, it says to eat, and the right side, bread. So thinking about the kind of everyday acts of violence in the marketplace, in conducting as one life, and women providing for their family, feeding their families, which is a kind of antithesis to those images that you would see with the purple stained fingers, right? That this great moment was coming because of the invasion of Iraq. And this is a little bit further in the project. I stopped working on Between Two Rivers for quite some time, moving on to different projects, different subjects, and returned to it after the rise of ISIL and what kinds of conditions and issues were permeating throughout Iraq for women in particular. The images shift from black and white to color in this project, largely to bring distinction between the two different projects. I felt like it's a continuing story as how we know ISIL came to be, and what were the particular conditions for women at that time in Iraq as a continuation from what happens when the central government was weakened and the state was weakened. And the representations of war and what kinds of images become popularized in the West, especially in the representation of the female body. This image on the right, Female Kurdistan Worker Party, PKK, was a very popular image that circulated around that time as this sort of antithesis to the ISIS moment or ISIL moment, where women were going to come out and fight their oppressors, right? And it makes me really think today about the images that were circulating online in a very different way, maybe not in mainstream media, but in social media, TikTok videos, Instagram accounts, primarily TikTok videos that are circulating about representations, or that depict the representations of women in war, women being these heroic, sexy, idealized, fetishized women as they're carrying guns, right? But all as instruments of the military complex, and how that representation, here you can be sort of seeing like the victimizer gets perpetrated. We are seeing all kinds of videos and imagery being produced by the Israeli occupation forces with women either participating in the propaganda or being as vehicles for that propaganda by the state. And so they're more in line to these kinds of images, but much more moving towards the sexy, idealized, fetishized, female bodied. And this whole spectrum of how women are represented in war and in conflict as victim to victimizer is something I've been working on for the majority of my career in one way or another, whether as the direct subject like you see in Between Two Rivers, or more implied as it is in other projects.
Mm. Yeah, well, thanks so much. And I always felt that your work really not only sort of summarized, some of the things that I've been working on, but I mean the way it also transgressed and shocked the viewer. I think I've always found very, very powerful. I want to sort of go back to the question of the female figure in your work, but I'm going to hand over to Kathryn and ask her to follow up at this point. Thank you.
No, thank you, Sama. That was really fascinating, and to see how you marked the transition in your work through black and white to color was also really powerful and really fascinating to see on screen. I wanted to ask you a bit more a question about Iraq, but in relation to your more recent work. And as an artist, you're also an educator, you're an activist, and you've been focusing on how legal frameworks in Iraq restrict the freedoms of Iraqi women and girls. So can you tell us a bit about your more recent work in relation to the political, the economic, and the social dynamics in Iraq?
Yes, thank you, Kathryn. And yeah, just quickly to add to what Nadje just said there, this shocking, right, the sort of image that shocks, I think it was very important to me to kind of disrupt the images that were more accustomed to seeing in the Western media when it comes to the female body from the Middle East and North Africa, because it's either very much absent or very flattened, right? And the notions of docility or being very covered, pious, or sexualized are kind of the most immediate references we have when we think about what that representation to be. And so let's see if this is going to move forward. So this is a little video clip from some of the new work I'm doing in Iraq, which I'll do my best to get a little bit into there, because I'm not actually working with a camera and what a camera produces, which is kind of an indexical image, right, of the body. And so one of the things I think it's really important to sort of step back to, because not everybody thinks about photography in the same way. First, remember that photography begins in the mid-19th century. It creates a sort of new epistemology where photographic images are considered authentic, they're considered objective, they're representations of reality, right? So we start to see theory that develops from there, where photographic representations are understood that they are not objective, that they're tools of framing, camera angle, cropping, the selections of images, and what's being put forward produces something that's not objective. And then we also have to consider issues pertaining to the ownership of media, like who owns the media sources and which ways they become distributed, and who are the target audiences for their consumption. And so that thinking about the manipulative nature of the medium has always really been, as you've seen, very significant, considering the coverage of war and the aftermath of war in my work, especially the representations of women and how perpetrators and victims, and that line between, and how that gets played. So for me, having had a long history of working in photography and being in critique of the medium, its origins, which the invention, is connected to the moment of the height of the imperialism, right, on a global scale, and how that instrument of the camera works to subject the subjects of the colonies, right? And so the colonial occupying power, and how that continues today. And so in some of my more recent projects, before I get to this work, Paratext, I start working on that timeline of image history from the Middle East and North Africa, and being much more explicit about discussing that image history, both from representations in the West and how the Middle East articulates their own representation through the female figure, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And thinking about today's kind of images that are made with surveillance, captured devices, especially in drone photography, where vertical warfare is being made by a remote location. And that starts to enter my work in 2020, 2021, which all gives me pause when I want to make work about Iraq again, because I start to think that the camera is a problem if I'm going to be making returning to Iraq after a 40-year absence to make work on location rather than just using my body as a site, right? That inadvertently, by using a camera, I might subject communities to harm, vulnerable communities to harm. There's locative material, there's identifying material, photography is indexical, and no matter what I try to remove or store in a server, something can be extracted. And just the idea of the camera itself in public space, and what kind of associations the public might have with it as they see me making an image of them with the camera. So it just felt very extractive, and that's the history of it. And I felt like I needed to work in a different method. And this is how I arrive at the LiDAR, which is a measuring device. Basically, it points out lasers, which measures the return of the laser, and in a 3D form. It's like basically all data and code. And then in the coding, I have to process it to bring a visual representation of that data. And there are many reasons for that beyond that. So in thinking about the aftermath of the US invasion and the rights and securities and the rights for women that dominate their lives in their public lives and in their personal lives, and what laws have been brought forward through the new constitution, or what it has displaced as previous laws by the personal article laws, which governs the rights of women in Iraq, women and girls, and the tension between them, and how that gets played on a social circle of their lives, right? Everything from workforce to personal lives like marriage, divorce, rights of belief, and work, and the physical spaces that they occupy. So the Guggenheim was the proposal that I wrote this for, and Iraq experiencing a period of relative, I don't want to say relative calm. It's not exactly where it's at, but a place where I felt that I could work in Baghdad and down in the southern marshes as well, without I've always worked in spaces of conflict, but I really didn't want to cause harm to anybody that would be working with me. And to do this kind of work, you need fixers, you need translators, you need drivers. And I didn't want to put anybody in a precarious situation working with me. My American accent, my American passport, I'm also an Iraqi, but it's also, I carry those identities as well. So this was the first sort of period in 2021. December is the first time I returned, and I returned 3 times since then to start this project, and working in female spaces that women occupy. So spaces that, like public spaces that you're seeing here, are in a traffic circle, to spaces that serve them, such as schools for women, barbershops, daycares, places that protect them, informal spaces such as shelters, to spaces that traffic them, sex shops, prostitution spots, and places like that. I worked in all of them, and I scanned in all of them, having to use different sort of performances and identities, and basically just pretending to be something I'm not in some of those spaces to be able to work. So this is really the kind of very beginning of Paratext, where I situate the public space. And now I'm working on all the interviews I've done with NGOs, with women who protect shelters, with victims of sexual violence, to everyday women in government, activists, and using text and data to create a kind of visual representation of a complex format and arena for women in post-war Iraq, if that's the right term. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to have the sound there. Just leave that on for a second.
No, I think it's so fascinating, because those are the spaces that are often ignored or seen as theoretically insignificant and forgotten or erased, or just not even looked at. So I think it's really great you're focusing on those informal spaces, which are enormously significant, because that's where you see where a lot of work is happening on the ground. And to see your different method as well is really fascinating, which I think would lead to the next question, Nadje, about.
Well, I wanted to sort of ask more about the female figure, but sort of listening to you and the work that you're doing currently, and you mentioned that it is right now a period of relative calm. I mean, I've also had lots of friends and family who go back and forth, but then at the same time, and I mean, you're probably aware of that, and the way that gender is actually being criminalized in Iraq right now. And some of the shelters that you're referring to, I've just saw a letter that was published by Ministry of Education, and basically saying that universities are not allowed to work with women's organizations and with shelters. And there is the last 6 months, this growing criminalization of anything that has to do with gender-based activism, feminist activism, and of course, anything linked to sexuality, for sure. So that's so interesting, and it's so tragic as well that in a moment when, you know, we're thinking, okay, we can actually, I mean, first, personally, I thought I could maybe teach during my sabbatical, but that is very yeah, it's very tricky right now. But so let me ask you more about the female figure, and more precisely your body, which is very much at the heart of much of your work. And so I wonder, what is the relationship between your body and the landscapes it inhabits? I mean, to my mind, and I mean, I've also read about this, and we've had conversations. I mean, these are not meant to be self-portraits, but they're depictions of characters, maybe allegorical characters. So can you tell us a little bit about the female figure in your work?
Yeah, that's exactly right. They're allegorical. They're characters. I mean, I started using the female. I mean, I started using my body really in undergraduate work when I was studying in art school at Columbia College in Chicago. And I I I entered that school to be a war photojournalist. I mean, that was my primary motivation back then, but very quickly realized that I was, first of all, very bad at it. And well, there was also no, I mean, there was social and political conflict in Chicago, but it wasn't the story I was like seeking, right, to talk about. And this is around the time I was introduced to the work of seminal Black photographers, notably Carrie Mae Weems, and thinking about how that representation, what I was missing and seeing in the news and magazines of that time, you know, Life magazine, National Geographic, the kinds of images, because this predates the internet, right? And the kind of global journalism, global citizenship journalism that winds up taking place after the internet is introduced. Yeah, so thinking about also the kind of, I mean, it's very important to understand that in that absence, I wasn't able to necessarily know that when I was using my own figure and body, that somehow inadvertently I was connected to how the female figure has come to represent national liberation struggles in Palestine historically, because I wasn't seeing those kinds of paintings or photographs or screen points of the liberation struggles and those kinds of imagery, but I was seeing it in a different way with representation, primarily in Black photography by Black photographer artists. And so, you know, eventually through my graduate studies, I started making that connection. As I was beginning to learn about Mona Hatoum's work, other people's works, and thinking about the body, being able to pay homage to resilience, to strength, to have a critique of social political conditions that have marginalized them. And yet it wasn't all that divorced from things that had interested me as a young person growing up. I was always into performance work. I didn't have the word performance. I'd like thought about it as acting, right? I was always interested in performance work. I had a very active imagination. And so when I actually had the opportunity to start embodying these, liberation struggles, these contexts that I wanted to bring attention to, and the actual physical representations of people's lives and experiences, it gave me just a very wide arena to make work, like in Sha'ab versus the Empire. Sha'ab, the three there is like the texting language of Arabic English that we get with phones during the time of the sort of sweeping Arab Spring that was felt at that moment amazing, winds up not being amazing later, but at that moment responding to it and thinking about like childhood fantasies of being a superhero character, AKA, or also kind of Muhammad Ali, you know, like childhood fantasy of like, you know, him being sort of like a hero, like standing up for brown and black people's rights against a war system, right? And embodying all of that, wearing the Pan-Arab colors and the red, white, green, black, and being able, this is winds up actually being an animation video. This is like the poster that you would see in front of instead of a match, like it's a marquee image that you come in and then you watch the video. And so, yeah, the figure in my photographs and video artwork can be a metaphor, can be a site, is attached to a history where the country, Palestine, the space of Palestine gets embodied through a female representation of motherland, that I wind up taking and extending to other issues of environment, of conflict, of post-war. And when you don't have, for me, I've always been in exile trying to make work about these situations. So as an undergrad, I wasn't even an American citizen yet. I didn't even have a functioning passport. Being from Iraq, I was still a political refugee at that time. And so the body became the only way to express our context, right? It's not like I could go do this war journalism in that place. I couldn't just drive down the street, or the severing to homelands, to spaces, to community, to culture was complete. And so the body becomes this temporary refuge and a site and a space that carries and encapsulates all those issues of war, of post-war migration, displacement, diaspora. And so that all gets sort of actualized through the body and moves through it as I, develop as an artist.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I just want to follow up with a question, Kathryn, if that is okay. Because Sama, I noticed that throughout, when you talk about your work, you mention two words quite frequently. One is resilience and one is resistance. And so I was wondering if you could sort of speak a bit about those terms, what they mean in the context of your work, how they overlap, how they interrelate, but also what is the distinction between the two in terms of how you see it and how you articulate it in your work, resilience and resistance.
Right. Well, in one aspect of it, having these sort of powerful feminized representations of the body were very, and of the female figure, to me, is a kind of resilience and resistance, right? So it has kind of a resistance, and it's also a disrupting figure that doesn't allow the kind of consumption as a pitied object or a they're all sort of fantastical, but not in this fetishized way, right? The figure is usually very strong, often isolated, and this also traces back to the history of Orientalism, where the female figure is usually out of context, divorced of scene, divorced of social condition, isn't doing anything with anybody, isn't placed with anybody, made ornamental and ornate, either covered or nude, sometimes both in the same image with a veil and then a naked body. And so all those kinds of refusals, right, that happen in the work to be represented in that lane is a kind of resistance. And the resilience, I think that winds up showing up more in my work as I mature as an artist. I mean, this early work here at Birthright does lament the conditions that we face and that I faced when I started traveling to the West Bank, Jerusalem, and 1948 cities where my mother grew up in, that are in part of Israel now, and so really I've never traveled to Gaza, but also consider issues from Gaza. It winds up it presents those issues, but it didn't necessarily at that moment, I don't think, in my early work, have the kind of representations of resistance where, I don't know if I could just I'll see if I can get to this real quickly. It's usually better when you have a visual representation rather than trying to talk about it in the abstract. Yeah. So in Marjana and Justice, if you really look at Justice, it recalls the kind of liberty image of like the balancing of the scales, but it is also a very large electricity pole, right, with a plant and water, and so resources, right, that are being described. But she's the figure that carries those resources. She's left alone with that burden. It is a burden over her head. It is a burden of her life condition, but also in the same time, she's a powerful feminized representation of resistance and resilience, right? And so, carrying those stories, carrying that sort of resistance is a big part of the project, literally, which is called Carryover. But those themes wind up coming out in a lot of my more recent practice, and as I mature as an artist, not even recently, traces back a while, and a refusal to let these stories go unconsidered, to let to our contexts and our situations that we do grapple with, the very difficult conditions of our lives, to remain in absence. And it's also an activist standpoint, because you are having to actively resist your representation and categorization in the face of voices that are there to stop you saying the things that you're saying. I mean, I'm not talking about something that happened 200 years ago and we're reading it through a history book. This is being made and remade every day. Every day that I am reading the newspapers, online newspapers, watching the news. I start my project in graduate school, I'm pregnant while I make that project, and the amount of articles, essays, news stories have been about the pregnant women in Palestine, and especially in Gaza, with the collapsing healthcare, with the conditions of war, with babies in incubators. All of these issues are ongoing issues, right? And they are issues that we face, and that I even faced when my body went and returned to Palestine as a 6-month pregnant woman, and having to navigate the security checkpoints and, the occupying forces as I move through the airlines to the country borders, through the checkpoints and everything afterwards. So that resistance is always being made to even make the work.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. Just again, to our audience, if you have any questions or comments, please put it in the Q&A function. Kathryn?
Yes, well, I think you've engaged with this question, but I'd like you to talk about it a bit more, because I think it's something tricky that I know I face as an ethnographer, where I get very much grounded in a particular locale and context. At the same time, very much concerned about the wider questions that are more universal, and trying to strike a sort of a balance of having to deal with the universal and the specific, and the global and the local. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about that in relation to the themes that you've been discussing in your work already, when it comes to war and conflict and exile and displacement, in the context, mainly in Palestine and Iraq, but at the same time, how you're dealing with universal sentiments and questions and debates.
Yeah, that's a tough one, and one that I think that no matter what you, well, especially as an artist, because people want to read your personal biography into every work you make. And so when you use your own representation, your own body, your own indexical representation, it perpetuates this idea that absolutely everything that you are talking about is specific to your life and your biography and your personal history, rather than being a site, right? And I don't know if that's a strength or a weakness of the work. I kind of go back and forth of whether I'm frustrated, or I actually think that's maybe a way in to capture people's care and attention, because the personalized becomes something interesting, but it can feel like a bit of a prison or a box that you get placed into, because right, it's just you're a site in the end, and not everything is a personal history. I mean, even when I make it very clear that this is about this condition or this issue or this more universal topic, I will have the questions in the Q&A. I can tell right away that that's all like not heard, right? And this and I think it's, you know, people would rather relate to the work they feel that empathy is by empathizing with you personally, rather than empathizing with a whole community that has never been made human to them before, right? It's just too difficult to think of women that, or an innate, or a community of people, or, you know, a whole place like Gaza that is being flattened if it was exactly like them and their cities and their people. But you individually are worthy of that empathy because they know you, they're seeing your face. So I've always had that that struggle in the work. And there are times, I mean, I think this carryover project really was me trying to push back from this idea that it's about my personal family history, where I might have started that way when I was working on Birthright. It sort of moved into a different direction, and thinking about that whole construction of the female figure and body through Orientalist tropes and all the scene making that was done in the mid-19th century with the ornate costumes, ethnic costumes, with the hookah and the Oriental carpet and the water vessel often carried in the head, and even using the printing processes of albumin, which is the 19th century process of egg whites on paper, like bringing all those tropes and then troubling them and interrupting them by creating these sculptural elements that articulates the dispossession, the displacement, the voids, right? The spatial voids that you see in the empty harvest baskets instead of being filled with oranges, that you historically see in those images, now being an empty idea being carried, but still playing onto those tropes and problematizing them, and further projects that come from that space. It's always it's always an issue, because it is true that these forced migrations and wars were the kind of moments in my life that gave inspiration for me even doing this work as my life work, and helps me stay focused on what's important on the project and not move away from it, but in the same time needing the creative control and openness, the flexibility to do work, because these are always, I mean, as you see the work I've been doing in Iraq, they're always originating from women's lives, right, and women's experiences, but there is the fictional element to all of it, and it's obvious in these performances that these are all and stagings, that these are all constructions. But again, going back to what I said, the problem with photography is the indexical representation. And so people see me, the artist, and then they see the image, and they want to make that connection immediate. And so it can be a problem.
Yeah, but it's also, I see your work is so grounded in a way, and it for me anyway, it makes me want to learn more about what you're doing within the context of Palestine or Iraq, but it's also forcing me to think about wider questions at the same time. So it's I think really powerful in that way, in how it's both sort of local but also global.
Yeah.
And just acutely aware of the time, Nadje.
Yes. Yeah, so we just have 9 minutes, Sama. So I'm going to read out the 2 questions and I'm going to link it to a question I had because we would like you to speak a little bit about your work in relation to Palestine. So Zehra Nasrallah is asking whether your work explores the concept of belonging or belongingness at all. If so, how? Alcia Phaidra is asking if you can explain a little bit more about the female figure and the concept of motherland, homeland in your work, saying that you mentioned a little, especially in relation to Palestine. So if you can elaborate. And then we have, I mean, I'm just sort of giving you the questions and you can sort of speak to, you know, what makes more sense and maybe combine it. Hanadi Al-Halabi says there appears to be a trend of underrepresentation of Middle Eastern women from racial minorities in Western media. Could you elaborate on the role of art in shedding light on the diverse facets of Middle Eastern communities and the multiple traditions and customs that coexist in terms of religion and traditions? And so, and me, I was sort of wondering about your work on Palestine, and now that you were an artist in residence, you had a Fulbright, and you had a series called Birthright. So maybe you can sort of bring it in, but we just have 7 minutes, so we don't have much time left. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I will just try to do that in reverse order, but as quick as I can. The Birthright is the project that I made during graduate school. As I said, in 2004, I went to Palestine for the first time because I received my U.S. passport, my citizenship in 2004. So that's the first place I went. And I talk about in the concept of return, but it's not like a physical return that I've been to a place before. It's the idea of the refugees returning, right? So my mother is part of the 1948 Nakba, depopulation of historical Palestine, which becomes the state of Israel. And the refugees have no right of return. And so I had to become a U.S. citizen. As an Iraqi, I had to become a U.S. citizen in order to return to my mother's homeland, which gets expressed in all these facets during this time. I mean, I was also married to an African-American, and pregnant with my second son during a time where the U.S. invaded Iraq, right? This is the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the 20-year anniversary of it's now. And thinking about the way motherhood, pregnancy, and that image of motherhood is assigned by others, by those who have power to represent. And what does it mean when your sons grow up to fight for the nation or to fight for their cause and their liberation struggles, or to defend or to invade, right? And the kind of spectrum of who is the victim, victimizer, perpetrator, perpetrated upon, that all was sort of taking place in my body. But I was also thinking of pregnancy being a kind of refuge, again, the body being the sort of vehicle for homeland, and mobile medium of bringing new life and new possibility, as my images often express of the refugees. Some images, like in Birthright, never really caught traction at that time, like this one, The Weight, because there was so little at that time, little representation in the media, as this idea of not being represented, and what stories get represented and what stories get told. The stories of that era were mostly surrounding intifadas, right? The image that you would see of Palestine was either first or second intifada kind of imagery, or the imagery that in the West described as the terrorist, and in the East described as, freedom fighters, right? And so these are the kinds of conundrums of perspective that were being explored in some of this project and further on. And in particular, I'm thinking about The Weight, The Weight spelled this way, and also the weight of time, where this deals with like the body being denied burial rights. So prisoners right now, you're seeing these articles about the prisoners incarcerated in prisoner morgues, refrigerators in Israel, or in unmarked graves, and having to serve out their term sentences and not be returned. Is the only country that does that. And these are not the stories that you would ever find in the press or in the news back then. And so there's a real invisibility and a lot of knowledge. And doing Birthright at that time was a very difficult project because I was facing a Western audience that knew very little, right? It knew a little bit about 48, maybe it knew about the 67 war, it knew about the intifadas and that, or, you know, the uprisings, it knew about suicide bombings and perhaps the hijackings, but it was very crude, very and not a lot of richness or detail or complexity or another perspective that of why those things were occurring. So I felt like, in a way, art gave me some open space to talk about subjects that people were uncomfortable speaking about or didn't know anything about or felt it was sort of a treasonous to even talk about or anti-Semitic to even mention. And it was it gave me a kind of a wider space to talk about the social political moment and its histories. Whereas now there's so much more information bringing back images like this. It's surprising how little contextualization I have to do in this moment when I represent these images. I showed target practice on my social media the other day and immediately received all of these direct messages and people who reposted it because the stories of pregnant women in Gaza were so profound. And one of the stories that people liked to share, felt comfortable sharing, because it was about women's vulnerability and babies' vulnerabilities, right? But trust me, in 2005, that was not an easy story to tell because the narrative was that women from this region were bombing producing machines. That was literally headlines I would take and inform how I wanted to speak about this vulnerability. You could see she's in the crosshairs of a target made with olives. And I'm sorry, I didn't remember the rest of the questions because I kind of just talk. Is there time for one more or no?
Yeah, one more quickly. I mean, the sense of belonging, maybe, or the idea of underrepresentation of artists from the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, the underrepresentation is primarily a problem of what our cultural institutions in Europe and the United States, which till this day have the most canonical power and influence. There is obviously counterpoints to that now in the Middle East because there are museums and institutions that have come about in the Gulf region. They are growing and expanding now in Saudi. These places do show Western artists, but they're also much more, they're as interested in showing their own. So there has been a lot more opportunity, and I benefit from that because I've always had a space to show my work, even in very difficult times. But we are going through this sort of cancel culture again right now. And that's not being just relegated to artists from Palestine or Iraq or from the Middle East. It's also those who support and who have been visible or, you know, on social media supporting Palestinian liberation struggles, or even just calling for a ceasefire, just concerned with the loss of life. And so that underrepresentation has been, it's ongoing, it's historic, it peaks in times of conflict. That has been pretty much my entire career, but at some points it also benefit artists from those regions who make work about these subjects have benefited in certain moments because there's a spotlight, right? And on those conflicts, and some institutions have been great. Some institutions, curators, writers, whatever, have been great at bringing the visual work of artists to the forefront. So it's mostly difficult.
Yeah.
And belonging and being, that's the body, right? It's always insisting and inscribing through your body your belonging to place, to history, to your stories, and to the ongoing conflicts and wars, and again, how you represent it and how you materialize it can say a lot about how you project a future and imagine an alternative space for yourself and those you're speaking for.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I have to say, Sama, I'm reminded, I mean, we haven't been talking, engaging for a while now, and I'm listening to you. I'm reminded that you are artist who's not only creating amazing, powerful art, but you're also so eloquent, and it's actually a real pleasure listening to you. And I mean, not just eloquent, but you also make very complex ideas accessible, which I really appreciate. I'd like to thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank the audience. And Kathryn, you want to say a few words?
Yeah, no, I was just to echo what Nadje said. It's been such a joy for me to get to know your work, and I've enjoyed this process enormously, and the conversation and how you speak to your work. It's, you know, I think it's very, very powerful, and the trajectory of your work, and to see how relevant it is and pertinent it is now, unfortunately, is quite alarming. But it's also great for us to talk and to communicate, and it's really important.
Well, I look forward to the day that it's not that pertinent anymore. Find another way to make work about something else. I don't know. But thank you so much. I really appreciate being with both of you and with the audience.
Yes. And also thank you to our team in the background who makes this all possible. Thank you. And the recording of this event will hopefully be available very soon. Thank you.